On October 27, 1962, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, an American destroyer dropped depth charges on a Soviet submarine operating in the waters near Cuba. The submarine, designated B-59, had been out of radio contact with Moscow for days. Its crew did not know whether war had already broken out between the United States and the Soviet Union. The air inside the submarine had become so depleted of oxygen that men were losing consciousness. The temperature had risen to over 50 degrees Celsius in some compartments. The submarine carried a nuclear torpedo. Its use required the agreement of 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander who happened to be aboard. The captain and the political officer both voted to launch. The flotilla commander voted no. His name was Vasili Arkhipov. He was 36 years old, and the argument he made in a sweltering submarine while depth charges exploded around him may have prevented a nuclear exchange that would have killed hundreds of millions of people. The crisis had lasted 13 days. The decision that may have saved the world lasted, by most accounts, a few minutes. To understand what happened aboard B-59, you have to understand what October 27, 1962 represented, because it was not just any day of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was the day the crisis came closest to becoming a war. The Cuban Missile Crisis had begun on October 16th, when American U-2 reconnaissance photographs revealed that the Soviet Union was installing ballistic missiles in Cuba. Missiles capable of reaching most of the continental United States within minutes of launch. President Kennedy had been informed that morning. 13 days of the most dangerous diplomatic confrontation of the Cold War had followed. By October 27th, the situation had reached a point of extraordinary danger. An American U-2 spy plane had been shot down over Cuba that morning, the first direct military action of the crisis. A separate U-2 had accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace over Alaska, nearly triggering a Soviet interception. Kennedy and Khrushchev were exchanging messages, but the messages were taking hours to arrive, and the situation on the ground was moving faster than the diplomacy. The American Navy had established a naval quarantine around Cuba. Soviet submarines operating in the area had been ordered to surface and identify themselves. When the submarines did not surface, the Navy began dropping small depth charges, practice charges, designed to signal the submarines to surface, not to destroy them. The American commanders assumed the Soviets understood this was a signaling procedure, not an attack. The crew of B-59 did not know this. The B-59 had been at sea for weeks. It had left the Soviet Union before the missile crisis began and had been largely out of contact since. The crew knew tensions were high, but they did not know the full picture of what was happening above the surface. When the depth charges began exploding around the submarine, the crew had no way of knowing they were signals rather than attacks. To the men inside B-59, it sounded and felt exactly like what a real attack would sound and feel like. The submarine could not surface to check. It could not make contact with Moscow. The batteries were running low. The air recycling system was failing. Men were collapsing from heat and oxygen deprivation. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, was convinced that war had begun. Savitsky ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared for launch. Under Soviet naval procedures at the time, the torpedo could be armed and launched with the authorization of 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, who was Ivan Maslenikov, and the senior officer aboard, who happened to be the flotilla commander, Vasili Arkhipov. Savitsky had authorization. Maslenikov had authorization. Arkhipov refused. What passed between the 3 men in those minutes is not fully documented. Arkhipov's wife, Olga, later described him as a calm, deliberate man who did not make decisions in haste. Contemporary accounts from crew members describe a tense argument in the cramped, sweltering command space of the submarine. Arkhipov's position, as reconstructed from subsequent accounts, was straightforward. They did not know that war had broken out. They had not received orders to use nuclear weapons. Without confirmation that war was actually underway, launching a nuclear torpedo would be an act of initiation, not retaliation, and that was not a decision that could be made by 3 men in a submarine without contact with their command. He was right. The depth charges were signals, not attacks. No war had broken out. The Soviet government had not ordered the use of nuclear weapons. Had the torpedo been launched, the Americans would almost certainly have responded. A nuclear torpedo, detonating in the waters near Cuba in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, would have been, in all probability, the first shot of a nuclear war. What would have followed is impossible to know with certainty, but the American nuclear response plan at the time called for a massive retaliatory strike. Arkhipov persuaded Savitsky to surface. B-59 came up into the Caribbean sun, was photographed by American forces, and eventually returned to the Soviet Union without incident. Vasili Arkhipov had faced a nuclear crisis before. In 1961, he had been the executive officer aboard K-19, a Soviet nuclear submarine that suffered a catastrophic reactor coolant failure. The crew had been exposed to lethal doses of radiation attempting to repair the reactor manually. Several died. K-19 was known in the Soviet submarine service as the Widowmaker. Arkhipov had been present during the decisions made aboard K-19. Decisions made under extreme pressure with incomplete information about whether to take drastic action or to wait. He had seen what happened when calm prevailed and what might have happened if it had not. Whether his experience on K-19 directly influenced his decision aboard B-59 is impossible to know. What is clear is that he was, by temperament and by experience, a man who understood that the worst decisions are made in moments of maximum stress, and who chose, in the worst moment he had ever faced, to slow down rather than act. The Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved diplomatically on October 28th, the day after the B-59 incident. Khrushchev agreed to remove the Soviet missiles from Cuba. Kennedy privately agreed not to invade Cuba and to remove American missiles from Turkey. The B-59 incident was not publicly known in the West until 2002, when documents were declassified and surviving crew members spoke at a conference in Havana. Thomas Blanton, the director of the National Security Archive, said at that conference that Arkhipov saved the world. Arkhipov himself never made this claim. He returned to the Soviet Union, continued his naval career, eventually retired as an admiral, and died in 1998. He was 72 years old. He never received a public honor for what he had done aboard B-59, in part because the Soviet government had no interest in publicizing the fact that its submarine had come within one officer's decision of launching a nuclear torpedo during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The B-59 incident reveals something that the official narratives of the Cuban Missile Crisis have consistently underplayed. The crisis is usually told as a story of two leaders, Kennedy and Khrushchev, managing a confrontation through careful communication and eventually reaching a diplomatic resolution. This is not wrong, but it is incomplete. What the B-59 incident shows is that the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis did not depend only on the decisions of the two most powerful men in the world. It also depended on decisions made by a Soviet submarine commander who could not be reached by either of those powerful men, in a vessel 300 feet beneath the Caribbean Sea without contact with Moscow, in conditions of extreme physical stress. The lesson is not reassuring. The lesson is that the management of nuclear crises depends not only on what happens in the rooms where leaders meet, but also on what happens in the places where leaders cannot reach, aboard submarines, inside missile silos, in the hands of officers who are authorized to act and who, in the wrong circumstances, might. Arkhipov happened to be the right man, in the right place, at the right moment. History is full of such accidents. The difference between this one and all the others is that this one, if it had gone differently, might have ended everything. Vasili Arkhipov cast one vote. He was not a president or a general or a diplomat. He was a flotilla commander on a submarine that nobody in Washington or Moscow knew was about to make the most consequential decision of the Cold War. He voted no. The torpedo was not launched. The crisis ended the following day. The official history of the Cuban Missile Crisis is a story of leaders and diplomats and the careful management of an extraordinary confrontation. That story is true as far as it goes. But underneath it, less visible and less celebrated, is another story. The story of what almost happened on October 27, 300 feet below the surface of the Caribbean Sea. And the story of one man who, in a sweltering submarine, with depth charges exploding around him, and his commanding officer convinced that the war had already begun, looked at the situation, thought about what he knew and what he did not know, and said no.